Now, back to your hosts, Erik Townsend and Patrick Ceresna.
Okay, Erik, at the top of the show, you teased our listeners about talking about some really big commodity trade that you've been speculating about. What's on your mind?
I'm going to make a case for recycling all of the high-level nuclear waste in existence and making a considerable profit from that undertaking. Now, to pull this off, you have to be able to negotiate directly with major governments and form treaties to take their spent nuclear fuel waste off their hands. So, obviously, this isn't something that retail traders can do in listed markets. Let's start with the basic facts. There's about 250,000 metric tons of high-level nuclear waste in storage around the world. Almost all of it is spent fuel rods from civilian power reactors. 95% of that spent fuel waste is perfectly good uranium that can and should be recycled in order to make new fuel rods to fuel tomorrow's reactors. The total amount of uranium that we could recover is about 237 metric tons, or about $26 billion worth at today's market price. Now let's start with the simplest form of this trade, which plenty of people before me have analyzed. If you're trying to justify this undertaking by assuming that you're going to use the money you sell the recycled uranium for in order to pay for the expense of reprocessing, well, that's a good idea, but the trade only becomes economic with uranium prices over $600 per pound, or approximately 10 times the current market price. In other words, it's nowhere close to profitable if your only cash inflow is going to be selling the recycled uranium, which is the way most people have looked at this trade. But I contend that if you put yourself in the shoes of the current holders of that spent fuel waste, they're forced to pay to store that waste indefinitely. And the storage costs are considerable. So my hypothesis is that any reasonable holder of spent nuclear fuel waste ought to be easily persuaded to pay the equivalent of several years' storage expenses in order to safely and responsibly get rid of that waste forever, get it off their hands so they don't have to worry about it ever again. And what shocked me, Patrick, was when I ran the cocktail napkin numbers and concluded that you really only need about 4 years of storage costs from the present holder of the waste in order to break even on this trade. If you can get them to pay you 5 years worth of storage costs just to take that waste off their hands, then it makes a nice profit. And if you could get them to pay just 10 lousy years of storage, and remember, their alternative is to keep storing that waste for hundreds or thousands of years. But if you could get them to agree to just pay 10 years worth of storage to get rid of that waste, you could make an obscene profit on this trade. Is it really that difficult of a sale when you say to the current holder of nuclear waste who expects to store that waste for hundreds of years that they could be done and over with it for once and for all for just 10 years worth of storage fees? Now stop and consider who you have to be in order to pull this trade off in the first place. You've got to be able to negotiate nuclear waste deals with entire nations. So you either have to be a sovereign government yourself, or you have to be Goldman Sachs, who has more high-level government contacts around the world than any government has. Now think about the PR value of ridding the world of nuclear waste. For the record, nuclear waste isn't actually anywhere close to as dangerous as people think it is, but that's beside the point. People think that nuclear waste is a really big deal. So if you're a country like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates that's already trying to establish itself as a leader in energy long beyond the age of oil, what could possibly be better PR than to have MBS waltz into the United Nations and tell the General Assembly, oh, okay, look, guys, we're Saudi Arabia, and we're going to do a good deed by ridding the entire world of all nuclear waste. Just because we can. We're Saudi Arabia, we're a long-term leader in the energy market globally, and that's just how we roll. So they upstage the West and do what Western governments have failed to do and get rid of all the nuclear waste. They say, hey, look, just send us all of your nuclear waste along with 10 years worth of storage fees, and we'll get rid of it for you. Then they buy up all the waste around the world, build some reprocessing plants, or just acquire Orano in France, and then be sure to get plenty of TV cameras on site when they start reprocessing waste for other countries. Now, of course, not all governments would cooperate, and some would reprocess their own waste to maintain control. But that doesn't matter. From a PR perspective, whoever was the first politician on the global stage to declare that he was going to solve the nuclear waste problem for once and for all, that guy is going to be a hero in the public's eye, regardless of what actually happens, and regardless of who ultimately winds up reprocessing that waste. And if they acquire Orano and the other reprocessors first, then the guys putting on this trade are sure to get paid for reprocessing, regardless of who contracts for that reprocessing. So if you're the Goldman in this story, you figure out who stands to gain the most politically from the PR stunt of solving the nuclear waste problem for the entire planet. And then you set the deal up so that head of state gets all the PR value and Goldman keeps all the profits for managing the reprocessing operation for themselves, as they always do. And for the right sovereign actor, this could be a PR goldmine.
That seems a little too easy. You already said the trade doesn't break even until $600 uranium unless the current holders of the waste are willing to pay you for several years of storage expense to take it off their hands. Surely someone else thought of this angle before, but wasn't able to get anyone to pay up to get rid of the waste. Am I missing something here?
This is a critical aspect of my trade hypothesis. There's a good reason that the current holders of spent nuclear fuel waste would reject the very assertion that recycling achieves the goal of getting rid of that waste, because as of now, it really doesn't achieve that goal. When you reprocess spent fuel waste, you recover the 95% that's perfectly good natural uranium. But the remaining 5% is some really nasty stuff called fission byproducts and transuranics. So in effect, reprocessing nuclear waste doesn't make the waste go away. It separates that cold cup of coffee we call nuclear waste into one cup of pure clean water and one small shot of concentrated nuclear espresso. So for the operator of this trade to claim that they've solved the waste problem by reprocessing all the waste would cause anti-nuclear activists to call foul, and rightly so. Reprocessing doesn't get rid of the nastiest nuclear waste. All it does is separate the 95%, which is perfectly good natural uranium, and concentrate the rest into about 1/20th of its present weight and volume. But all the bad stuff is still in that 5% that remains after the spent fuel waste was reprocessed. But wait, it gets even worse. Among other things, that 5% of nuclear waste espresso that I'm talking about contains some plutonium. Yep, that's right. The stuff they make nuclear bombs with is contained in that waste. So when you reprocess uranium, you concentrate the worst of the waste in the process. And it can be argued that you measurably increased nuclear weapons proliferation risk by doing so. The primary reason that civilian nuclear power is perceived as a weapons proliferation risk is that with enough work, it's theoretically possible to extract enough plutonium from the waste to make a nuclear bomb with. And India actually did that using a repurposed Canadian power reactor back in the 1950s. Now, it takes a lot of effort to separate the plutonium from the rest of the waste, but removing all the uranium and concentrating the remaining waste 20 times just means that if we recycled all the waste in existence, who's ever in possession of the remaining 13 metric tons still has all the plutonium that was previously diluted in the original 250,000 metric tons of waste, which is now in storage. But it would be concentrated 20 times into those 13 metric tons. So I contend that to persuade the current holders of spent fuel waste to be willing to pay you 10 years' worth of storage just to take it off their hands, all you should need to do is be able to prove to their satisfaction that you really do have a credible plan to make that waste truly go away, not concentrate it into nuclear espresso, but truly eliminate it from existence. Now remember, my whole hypothesis is that the best actor to put this trade on is a sovereign government like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, who already has a vested interest in establishing itself as a leader in the nuclear energy industry. Now, with that context, this trade really starts to get interesting. One of the most exciting advanced nuclear technologies that will be explained in Episode 6 of my soon-to-be-released docuseries on energy transition is called a burner reactor. It's a close cousin to a breeder reactor, which is also explained in that episode. But a burner reactor is a special kind of nuclear reactor that can actually burn that last 5% of nuclear waste espresso and consume it as fuel to make electricity with. So the real play here for Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates is to do both at once. First, you acquire all the advanced nuclear companies that are building waste-burning reactor prototypes right now. And yes, there are startup companies building waste-burning reactor prototypes right now as we speak, and for full disclosure, I even own a piece of one of them. But my point is, once you're building and operating waste-burning reactors, you have a bona fide way to assure the present holders of nuclear waste that if they're willing to pay you just 10 years of storage fees, you really can safely dispose of that waste for them for good. Not just concentrate it and recover the uranium, but truly dispose of the nastiest 5% of nuclear espresso so that it literally does not exist anymore. I contend that any reasonable party would take that deal if you can persuade them that you really and truly do have the capability of burning up and disposing of that waste completely. And with 10 years of storage fees, this trade makes an insane profit. You could easily recover the cost of acquiring the companies you need to acquire in order to do it. Now, a U.S. actor could never pull this off. Burner reactors are so far beyond what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission knows how to regulate that you could never get government authorization to actually turn one of these things on. But if you're a sovereign government like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates, you just hire the best nuclear regulators and start your own NRC, and then you fast-track the waste-burning reactor industry without all the bullshit and red tape that would prevent the U.S. government from doing it in anything less than 20 years' time. There are guys out there right now building prototypes of these burner reactors, right here, right now in 2023. You hire them by acquiring them, and you seduce them into the acquisition by offering them a cooperative jurisdiction to test and develop their advanced nuclear products that the West has been extremely slow to appreciate the strategic value of and to permit. And once you've acquired all the companies building burner reactors, you can realistically sell the idea that I'm describing to the present holders of nuclear fuel waste. And it's a whole new proposition. You really are proposing to dispose of that waste, not to concentrate it, but to dispose of it for once and for all.
Aren't both Saudi Arabia and the UAE already running programs where they're trying to establish themselves as global leaders in nuclear energy?
I should confess that I'm only just starting to learn about both of those countries' nuclear programs. But to be honest, from what I've seen so far, I really have to wonder who's advising them and what the heck they're thinking. Again, please forgive me, folks, if I have these details wrong. I'm just starting to come up to speed on the nuclear aspirations of Middle Eastern oil exporting nations, and I probably don't have all of my facts straight yet. I'll do my best to tell you what I know based on what I know so far. The first part of this makes perfect sense. Both Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have already made announcements that their intention is to remain global leaders in the energy business long after the age of oil winds down. And therefore, they're already making investments now to establish themselves as leaders in nuclear energy. So far, so good. I couldn't possibly imagine a better strategy for them to adopt, and I firmly believe that control of the small modular reactor industry that doesn't even exist yet is going to determine the course of world history, and specifically the phenomenon that the Middle East enjoyed, where oil made them just fabulously wealthy, is going to be repeated in that SMR industry. So whoever controls that is going to define the future of energy on this planet. That's definitely where any country that views energy as its strategic future has to be. And I'll have more on that subject in episode 7 of my docuseries, which will be released later this month on the Macro Voices YouTube channel. So when I heard that Saudi Arabia intends to be a leader in nuclear, my first thought was that MBS is right on top of this. He gets it, he sees the big picture, and he knows how to keep his country on top of the global economy by using the money they already made from oil to establish themselves as leaders in advanced nuclear energy. Brilliant, perfect strategy, and they have an incredible opportunity right now to literally acquire the entire advanced nuclear industry for a price they can easily afford to pay. So that's what I assumed they were talking about when they said they wanted to invest in becoming a leader in nuclear energy. I figured MBS is a smart guy who surely has figured out by now that one of the biggest problems with conventional uranium-fueled, water-cooled nuclear reactors is that you need a large ocean or river to build one of these silly things because of the cooling water demands that they have. So I figured MBS has to be all over molten salt reactors. That's the kind of reactor that you can operate in the desert without a river or an ocean nearby to supply cleaning water. That would be the obvious and logical place for Saudi Arabia to really establish itself with a controlling interest in what I think will be the most important formative new industry of the 21st century. And they could easily afford to acquire every single important company in that field tomorrow morning if they wanted to. But then I dig a little deeper and learned that MBS's plan to establish Saudi Arabia as a nuclear leader is to hire the South Koreans to build him an old-school, once-through, light water-moderated, uranium-fueled reactor. Okay, now I'm confused. First, I thought Saudi Arabia had an utterly brilliant strategy to establish itself as leaders in a formative new industry that will determine the future of energy. That's what they should be doing. I thought that's what they said they were going to be doing. But instead, they're hiring South Koreans to build them a shiny, brand new example of the exact technology that needs to be replaced in order to really get the nuclear renaissance on track. Now, all that I know is what I can find on Google. But in my opinion, if all that Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are actually doing in this space right now is just building Korean light water reactors because they can afford to buy one, well, that's like saying you want to get into the publishing business, so you're going to start by buying yourself a subscription to Playboy. That's not being in the publishing business. That's just being a consumer of pornography. And building an old-school uranium-fueled light water-moderated nuclear power plant in Saudi Arabia is not equivalent to getting into the nuclear business in any meaningful way. That's just consuming the old guard nuclear industry's failing and antiquated products. For what reason, I'm not even certain. Now, don't get me wrong. If I wanted to build an old-school conventional nuclear power plant, I would hire the South Koreans in a heartbeat long before I would give that business to Westinghouse. So in terms of choosing the right vendor to build his old-school, dated technology nuclear power plant, MBS definitely chose the right people. But the question I'm left with is why in the world MBS would think that building an old-school nuclear plant in Saudi Arabia has anything to do with getting Saudi Arabia into the business of being a leader in advanced nuclear energy technology. To do that would require completely different actions, which I don't see Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates taking, at least not yet. Whether that means they don't get it yet or it just means that they're taking their time before making their important moves isn't really clear. But so far, they're not doing any of the things I think they need to do in order to achieve their stated goals. And I can't say this strongly enough. If there's anything I've learned from spending almost a year on this docuseries project, it's that what's really needed to accomplish energy transition by 2050 is at least 10 times more challenging than all of these COP conference idiots even understand. Ramping up a small modular reactor industry based on Generation 4 advanced nuclear technologies is an utterly massive undertaking. It's so big that it's on the scale of trying to build the biggest building in the world out in the middle of the desert where you don't even have anything but soft sand, so it's not even possible to build a foundation. Well, it seems to me that the same folks that figured out how to build the Burj Khalifa are rather better financed than the American National Reactor Innovation Center. So if you wanted to leapfrog everything going on in pressurized water SMRs across the world by beating everyone else to market with the first molten salt SMRs, the way to do that would be to acquire the various companies like Copenhagen Atomics, Seaborg, Thorcon, and all the rest who are doing exciting things with advanced nuclear technology. In finance terms, think of it as a roll-up of the best advanced nuclear startups into a single entity that pools all the engineering talent of those former competitors to work together in a concerted effort to supply the world with enough Generation 4 SMRs to solve energy transition, while making a profit eliminating all the world's nuclear waste in the process. Patrick, the total market cap of all of the most interesting advanced nuclear startups combined is only a few $1 billion. The Arabs spend that on sporting goods in a good year. They could literally own the entire advanced nuclear industry and cement their role as the long-term supplier of energy to planet Earth if they wanted to. But instead, they're building old-school light water reactors in the desert, where molten salt reactors shine best. That doesn't make any sense. I don't get it. But again, I want to stress that I am not expert on Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates plans, and all I know is what I read online. But quite frankly, if someone who actually knows of what they speak is advising them, they've been very slow to act on that advice so far. At least that's my opinion. I'll be in UAE on holiday in early October, so MBZ and MBS, if you guys are listening this week, let's do lunch in Dubai in October, and I'll give you a free brain dump on what I think you ought to be doing in order to seize control of entire industry segments that will define the future of nuclear energy. Building more old-school light water reactors from South Korea won't be on the agenda. We need to talk about molten salt reactors, the kind that work in the desert without needing an ocean or a major river. That's the technology to focus on if you want to truly lead the coming nuclear renaissance.
On the off chance that MBS or MBZ should happen to miss this week's episode of Macro Voices, is there any way for your trade idea to come to life without them?
Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates are the obvious actors to make this happen. But I think there's a lot to be said just for getting the basic idea on the table so that everybody knows about it. Most professional investors know that there's a futures trade called a crack spread that allows a trader to almost perfectly recreate financial profits of an oil refinery. Now, in my experience, that trade actually gets used by traders less often than it gets used at cocktail parties, because at cocktail parties, people explaining that trade sound smarter than they really are. So if there's one thing that I want to accomplish by doing this segment on Macro Voices this week, it's to seed the finance industry with a new bit of cocktail party trivia to impress others with your knowledge. Specifically, I want to make everyone in finance aware of the fact that nuclear fuel waste can and should be eliminated completely. And doing that is as simple as contracting the French company Orano to reprocess your waste for you, and then burning the remaining concentrated waste in a waste burner reactor. The only reason the private sector hasn't already stepped in and solved this problem where governments have failed is because to make this trade economic, you either need uranium prices over $600 or you need to persuade the supplier of the waste to pay you several years' storage fee to take it off their hands. And that last bit is a really tough sell unless you already own a working burner reactor, something nobody on Earth has right now, but which several smart guys already know how to build, and a few are already actually building. Acquiring those companies and fast-tracking construction of the first burner reactors is the key to being able to sell the present holders of nuclear waste on the idea that you truly have the ability to get rid of it. For a fee, of course. If everyone listening to this podcast, and particularly those of you in professional finance, simply take this story and tell it at your own cocktail parties, before long the word will be out and everyone will know what's possible. And you'll be much more entertaining than the guy cracking the joke for the 14,000th time about his colleague predicting 6 of the last 2 recessions. Once the word is out, it's just a matter of time until somebody at Goldman steals the idea, decides which politician they're going to pitch the PR value to, while Goldman keeps all the profits for themselves.
Are there any other reasons not to recycle all of the nuclear waste in existence?
Just about anyone who's recognized as an expert on nuclear energy or nuclear waste is going to voice a loud objection saying that my whole proposal is completely silly and stupid, because there is no real serious problem with nuclear waste to start with. It's just not anywhere close to as dangerous as the public perceives it to be, and the experts are right about that part. And to be clear, I couldn't possibly be more disappointed in my nuclear expert friends' inability to perceive the obvious. So let me lay the facts of life out for you nuclear experts who think this is all a pointless waste just because nuclear waste isn't really all that dangerous to start with. Look, we have a completely dysfunctional nuclear industry precisely because of irrational fears held by the public. The fact those fears may not be rational isn't relevant, and frankly, I find it tiring when supposed experts seem to have difficulty grasping the simple concept that we need to make nuclear waste go away for the simple reason that hysterical people who don't understand it are going to stay hysterical and scared until something changes. If you make the waste go away and you can tell them it doesn't exist anymore, they will calm down. But until you actually get rid of the waste, they're going to be convinced with all of their hysteria that it's a bigger problem than it is. That's why we need to get rid of the waste, because the public has already convinced themselves that it's bad and they're not going to change their opinion this late in the game. The available options are to keep storing that waste and have the public remain irrationally obsessed with fear about waste, or we can get rid of the waste for once and for all so that we can honestly tell the public that the problem has been completely solved and all of the waste is now scheduled to be reprocessed and then consumed in burner reactors. Yes, it's a PR problem, not an engineering problem. And for the record, engineers, PR problems are generally much more important than engineering problems. The solution to this very important PR problem is to make the waste go away so that the public can't fear it anymore. Engineers should not focus their engineering talents on perseverating over why they don't think it's a problem. They should focus their engineering talents on solving this very real problem. We talked about waste disposal today, and the other two big objections to nuclear, which are meltdowns and weapons proliferation risk, will be addressed in episodes 5, 6, and 7 of my upcoming docuseries.
All kidding aside, are you really going to be in Dubai in October? And are you serious about wanting to pitch this idea to people like MBZ and MBS while you're there?
Indeed, I will be in Dubai in early October, and while I have no fantasies of MBS or MBZ dropping what they're doing to come meet with me, I do believe in the power of the podcast. We know for a fact that we've had OPEC oil ministers listening to Macro Voices in the past when their buddy Dr. Anas Al-Haji was featured in our crude oil special several years ago. So we're only 1 or 2 steps removed between our audience and the people in power. And besides, MBS and MBZ are the wrong people anyway. They would never meet with me because I don't have any formal credentials in this field. And besides, my pitch would be too technical and detailed for them. The real power over there lies with the money interests, and the governments seem to just serve their interests. I'm not even persuaded that the governments themselves are the ones making the final decisions in the Arab world. So obviously, I'd love to be involved in this deal myself if I can find a way to get my fingers into it. But even if I never see any part of this, even if Goldman Sachs just steals my ideas and takes credit for them themselves and I never make a penny off it, I'll still be telling myself that I was the guy who came up with the idea that solved the nuclear waste problem. Of course, the gentlemanly thing to do, Goldmanites, would be to hire me as an advisor. But gentlemen in the finance industry have become scarcer than heavy elements, so I won't expect anything more than bragging rights if someone decides to carry this idea forward without me.
That concludes this edition of Macro Voices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. Macro Voices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com, the Internet's premier source of online education for traders. Please visit BigPictureTrading.com for more information. Please register your free account at MacroVoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the internet each week. You'll also gain access to our free listener discussion forums and research library. And the more registered users we have, the more we'll be able to recruit high-profile feature interview guests for future programs. So please register your free account today at macrovoices.com if you haven't already. You can subscribe to Macro Voices on iTunes to have Macro Voices automatically delivered to your mobile device each week, free of charge. You can email questions for the program to mailbag@macrovoices.com, and we'll answer your questions on the air from time to time in our mailbag segment. Macro Voices is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Macro Voices should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Macro Voices are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or sponsors. Macro Voices, its producers, sponsors, and hosts Erik Townsend and Patrick Ceresna shall not be liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on information or viewpoints presented on Macro Voices. Macro Voices is made possible by sponsorship from BigPictureTrading.com and by funding from Fourth Turning Capital Management, LLC. For more information, visit macrovoices.com.